So the gospel today is the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, or the Beatitudes. And this sermon is a wonderful reminder of what being a saint actually looks like, as well as the expectation that we strive for holiness, because it's what we were created for. And it's also a good reminder of why I'm doing this series on the saints, to help create a picture of this. Now this week, we're celebrating a number of things. The 31st is the feast of St. John Bosco. He's a priest who is particularly known for working with the youth, and I'm going to speak about him a little bit more in a few moments. The first, for those of you who like your Irish saints, is the traditional feast of St. Bridget of Kildare. And the second is the purification of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And again, I'm going to comment on that feast a little bit more extensively as well. But it's also the commemoration of St. Cornelius. I'll just read you his entry from the Martyrology. At Caesarea in Palestine in the 1st century, the holy centurion Cornelius, who was baptized by the holy apostle St. Peter, and by him also raised to be bishop in that city. So we read about this in the Acts of the Apostles. The next day, the 3rd of February, is the feast of St. Blaise, which most people only know because of ailments of the throat. But I want to share again, just briefly, his entry in the Martyrology. At Sebaste in Armenia, in the time of the governor Agricolaus, the Passion of St. Blaise, bishop and martyr, who after working many miracles, was scourged a long time and suspended from a tree where he was lacerated with iron combs. He was then imprisoned in a dark dungeon, thrown into a lake from which he came out safe, and finally, by order of the same judge, he and 2 boys were beheaded. Before him, 7 women who were gathering the drops of his blood during his torture were recognized as Christians, and after undergoing severe torments were put to death by the sword. But, like I said, I'd like to go back and comment a bit more on the purification, the feast of February 2nd. Now, it's traditionally called the purification. In the modern Mass, it's called the Feast of the Presentation, and it goes back to the fact that in the modern church, we treat Our Lady like embarrassed teenagers. And we probably rationalize it with a bad heretical idea that by giving honor to Our Lady, that we are taking something away from God. Remember, when we praise a saint, we are praising God because it is only because of God and God's grace that that saint is a saint. So we're not taking anything away from God. The preface of the saints in the Mass, in the Missal, has this line which poetically sums it up. It says, "For you are praised in the company of your saints, and in crowning their merits, you crown your own gifts." And so we don't want to in any way pretend that the purification is a side effect. Because first of all, the purification is the main reason that the Holy Family is in the temple. They're there on this 40th day because of the law of Moses, which demanded a sacrifice on the purification of the women after giving childbirth. Now, Our Lady, of course, is immaculate, but that means she's also humble and obedient, and therefore obeyed the law of Moses and went for this rite of purification. But of course, we also commemorate this presentation. But presentation is a bit of a weak word. Our Lord is not simply being presented, as in here he is. He's being ransomed. Because again, according to the same law of Moses, the firstborn males were all ransomed by a sacrifice. Because God spared the firstborn during the Exodus, and he then demanded the sacrifice. Now, this is not because God just looks for sacrifice. All of this was to foreshadow the fulfillment of that ransoming of the firstborn with the presentation of Christ, but also the fact, and even more beautifully, that he is not going to be spared as the firstborn only begotten of God, but he is indeed going to die for us. Interestingly, speaking about the names of this feast, in the eastern part of the church, they don't refer to either of those as the feast day. They refer to this feast day as the meeting because it's referring to the meeting of Simeon and Anna in the temple with the Christ child. In English, we call this Candlemas. It's the Mass of Candles, literally, because of the traditional blessing and procession with candles. And this is in honor of the words of Simeon at this meeting, that Christ is the light to the Gentiles. But finally, I want to add one more comment about the Feast of the Presentation, and that is the purification. Is that there is a traditional practice among Catholics, which unfortunately is not very common today, referred to in English as the churching of women. The Roman ritual provides a blessing for a woman who is coming to the church for the first time after giving birth. It's a very beautiful prayer and blessing. It's a very beautiful practice, and it's one that I want you to encourage people to be, let people know about, and make sure that you remind them when necessary that I would like to do that. I would rather do it with a little bit of warning, though, like when they first show up, instead of me noticing someone in a pew during my sermon and calling them up to do it at that point. It'd be nice to be more organized. But it's a beautiful little prayer, and it's a beautiful practice because it recognizes that we owe God thanks for a safe delivery, that we need God's grace to raise our children, and it's a little offering of the child. The real offering, of course, happening at baptism, and those two things should not be too far separated in time. In fact, they could be happening on the same day. So anyway, I want people to know about this because I think it's very beautiful and a very helpful practice. What I just want to end with here, just a few moments, is a commentary on something related to St. John Bosco. Now, St. John Bosco is particularly a patron for those who work with the youth. There's really not much I want to comment on that, simply because the youth are the youth. The youth need the attention. I'm glad to give the attention. I'm very grateful for those who helped me with that. But in his ministry, St. John Bosco was known to have prophetic dreams. And one of them is particularly well known, but you may not know it. So I want to share it and comment on it because I think it's very rich as well. The full text is in the bulletin, but just to give you a summary, the image he has is, the dream he has is of the church represented as a ship, as it usually is historically, iconographically, with the Pope at the helm, in a storm-tossed sea, attacked by enemies all around. And in the sea, the Pope sees these two columns, a shorter one surmounted by Our Lady with the words, "Salvation of Christians," and on the other one surmounted by a Eucharistic host. The Pope pilots the ship, which is the church, between the columns, anchors them to the columns, the sea becomes calm, and the enemies are scattered. And the reason I want to comment on this is not just because it's beautiful, but because it also beautifully summarizes a number of points all in one vision, and provides us for a very good measure for what Christianity is in its fullness, because sometimes we have too limited of a view of it. So the first is the fact of divine revelation. The first verse of the Epistle to the Hebrews goes somewhat like this. That God in various times has spoken to us in the past through the prophets and in various ways. And in these last days he has spoken to us through his Son. And that really is a good summary of divine revelation. That Jesus Christ, being God, is himself the fullness of revelation. And that any other aids to understanding that revelation or hearing that revelation are beneficial, especially the sacred scriptures, but the Bible is not God's only revelation. The actual revelation of God is the Word made flesh, Jesus Christ. And that even after Jesus, that God can and does still speak to us, either directly, individually. He speaks to us in private revelation, which is shared. I'm speaking here particularly of apparitions of Our Lady, but even things like the book Insignium Jesu, etc. So these are all private revelation. While a Catholic is not bound to believe them, some of them do have the approbation of the Church, because the criteria that's used is that they are not contrary to what has been revealed already in public revelation. And so we can be open to these things. And while I don't certainly want to encourage you to go around and search for private revelation, We want to understand that God is bigger than our narrow ideas, particularly of the people who ask you, where's that in the Bible? Okay? We have to look beyond that. The church has been given the authority to interpret the scriptures and to pass on that revelation, and that is extremely important. We also see in this dream the importance of the hierarchical church. Now, no matter what the failings of the clergy are, and they are many from the top down, and many of them are very grave, and they're even more grave than normal because the clergy should know better, that doesn't change the fact that the mystical body of Christ in visible form in this church, in this world, is the hierarchical church which Christ founded, and that we have to participate in it for salvation. We also see that the taller of the two columns is surmounted by the Eucharistic host, and this shows that the sacraments are important, but of course, the most blessed sacrament of the Eucharist especially. God has given himself to us completely, body, blood, soul, and divinity in the Holy Eucharist, and the only reasonable and the only loving response then is to give ourselves to him in the Eucharist as well, to be disposed properly to receive him, properly disposed both physically and spiritually. And finally, if we accept that we are children of God, sons in the Son, as the saying goes, and that means that we're members of the family of Christ, that means that we are brothers and sisters, including our older brothers and sisters, the saints, and that we have the same mother. That he has given us his own mother for our mother, and we would be the most ungrateful of children to not love her as he does. So, again, why are these 4 points particularly important? Because in order to be Christian, we have to understand that we cannot have God's revelation the way he wants us to have it. Not on our terms, the way he wants us to have it, outside of the teaching authority of the church. It's all part and parcel of the same reality. We cannot have his revelation the way he wants it outside of this authority of the church. We cannot have God the way that he wants us to have him outside of the Catholic Church. Yes, we can have him to degrees, but we cannot have him completely the way he wants us to have him outside of the church. Somehow, if anyone is saved, and there will be people who are saved because of God's mercy and their ignorance, they are saved somehow in the one universal church established in a hierarchy. We cannot regularly receive God's grace the way he wants us to have it outside of the sacraments. And we cannot have it outside of the sacraments because it is the way that he has established, because it is best for us as sensible creatures. We need to have the sacraments. We cannot have Jesus the way he wants us to have him without his Blessed Mother, and in a related way, the saints as well. And why would we not want to have her as our own Blessed Mother? And so for the greater glory of God, for the salvation of souls, especially our own, let us come to know and really love Jesus by cultivating a great love for the sacraments, especially the most blessed sacrament of the altar, whether that be in the sacrifice itself, when reserved here in the sanctuary, or in our receiving him in Holy Communion. Dedicating ourselves to our Blessed Lady, and of course to St. Joseph, who always brings us to her Son, and especially by allowing her to teach us how to contemplate him in the mysteries of her rosary, and loving and respecting the Church of God, the mystical body of Christ, regardless of the many problems with the clergy, both are in heaven, on earth, and in purgatory.